The air in the high-altitude chamber tasted of recycled metal and ozone. Dr. Sarah Brennan held the stress position, her body a rigid sculpture of controlled endurance. Her knuckles hovered precisely 1 inch from the polished concrete floor. Her back formed a flat plane parallel to the earth. Her legs locked in a deep squat that burned through the quadriceps of men twice her size. For 47 minutes she had not moved. Not a tremor, not a single concession to the screaming protest in her muscles, or the screaming silence of the observers on the other side of the reinforced glass. The only sound was the slow, measured cadence of her own breathing, a quiet metronome counting down the limits of human will. The men outside had stopped their quiet jeering 20 minutes ago. Now they just watched. They watched the impossible stillness, the absolute discipline that felt more like a machine than a person. It was in that perfect, unyielding quiet that the first crack in their certainty appeared. Discipline is not the absence of desire. It is the mastery of it. The voice that would tell this story belonged to Master Chief Petty Officer Frank Callahan, 62 years old, a slab of granite carved from 40 years of naval service. His face bore the deep lines of a man who had seen 3 decades of war, from the frozen checkpoints of Cold War East Germany to the burning oil fields of Desert Storm. His eyes were the color of storm clouds over the North Atlantic, and they had witnessed things that never made the news. He stood now in the observation room, arms crossed over a chest that still carried the hard muscle of a younger man. His voice when he spoke was a low gravel that commanded immediate attention. "I've trained SEALs for 40 years, he said to the junior officer beside him. "Never seen anything like what happened that day in Alaska. Let me tell you about Dr. Sarah Brennan." The briefing room smelled of stale coffee and damp cold weather gear. It was a sterile, windowless box at Fort Richardson, Alaska, where the winter clawed at the walls with an audible howl. Lieutenant Commander Marcus Webb stood before a large digital map, his laser pointer a nervous red dot dancing over topographic lines. 5 men from his SEAL team sat around the table. Their postures were studies in casual lethality. They were broad-shouldered, thick-necked, and carried the quiet, predatory confidence of men who had seen the worst of the world and made it blink. Sarah Brennan sat slightly apart from them. Her chair was perfectly aligned with the edge of the table. She was not one of them. At 5'4" and 128 pounds, she appeared almost delicate in this room of physical extremes. Her presence was a concession to a new kind of warfare, an acknowledgement that the enemy was no longer just a man with a rifle, but a ghost in the signals, a whisper on the wind. She was an analyst, a specialist in human terrain systems, brought in to find a target who had evaporated into 100 square miles of brutal, unforgiving wilderness. "The target is codenamed Volkov," Webb said, his voice low and rough. "Russian national, former Spetsnaz, expert in alpine warfare and electronic countermeasures. He's been training local insurgents, turning them into a Tier 1 threat. Every attempt to track him with drones or satellite imagery has failed. He's a ghost." Webb gestured towards Sarah with a flick of his hand that was meant to be inclusive but felt like an afterthought. "Dr. Brennan is our solution. She specializes in predictive tracking based on environmental and psychological profiling. She believes Volkov is following a specific pattern, one tied to the terrain itself." A thick-armed operator with a perpetually cynical expression leaned back in his chair. The metal groaned in protest. Petty Officer Thomas Aldridge had the weathered face of a man who had stopped believing in easy solutions a long time ago. "A psychologist," he said, his voice soft but carrying a sharp, dismissive edge. "We're going to chase a ghost through the mountains based on a hunch about his feelings." Another operator, younger and built like a heavyweight boxer, let out a short, humorless laugh. Petty Officer Jake Drummond was all coiled power and explosive energy. His face still carried the smooth arrogance of new strength. He radiated an impatience with anything that did not involve direct, overwhelming force. "Maybe we can ask him to lie on a couch for us when we find him." Drummond added, his eyes flicking to Sarah, searching for a reaction. She gave him none. Her gaze remained fixed on the map, her expression as neutral as the gray walls. Her stillness was a language they did not understand. They were men of action, of explosive movement and visceral response. Her economy of motion seemed alien, an unnerving counterpoint to their restless energy. She saw the world in patterns, in the subtle logic of water finding its way downhill, of a predator choosing its hunting ground not by whim, but by instinct and necessity. She understood that Volkov was not a ghost. He was a man, and a man, no matter how well trained, left traces. He left them in the displaced stones on a game trail, in the faint radio frequency leakage from his equipment, in the psychological constants that dictated his need for high ground and a secure water source. These were the things she saw, the things they were blind to. Before Webb could respond, a voice cut in from the doorway. It was a voice that changed the atmosphere in the room like a weather front moving through. Doctor, Brennan's hunches are based on more concrete data than any satellite feed you'll ever see. Master Chief Frank Callahan stepped into the room and the space seemed to contract around him. He was not the largest man present, but his authority was absolute, earned not on a spreadsheet, but in the mud and blood of places that never made the news. His uniform bore the crisp precision of a man who still honored the old standards. The trident on his chest was faded from decades of salt spray and desert sand. He had requested her, pulled her from a quiet life of data analysis and thrust her into the raw physical world of special operations. His eyes the color of a winter sea locked onto Aldrich. Her hunch, Callahan said each word deliberate, has a 93% success rate in forecasting movement of high-value targets in complex terrain. She is here to make your job possible. Your job is to listen to her and keep her alive. Nothing else. The silence that followed was heavy with resentment. These were men who measured competence in bench press repetitions and marksmanship scores. Sarah's strength was of a different kind, quieter, more patient, rooted in observation and analysis. To them, it was invisible, and therefore it did not exist. Webb cleared his throat, trying to reclaim control of the briefing. All right, we'll be inserting by helicopter at 0400, here. He circled a barren plateau on the map. From there, we move on foot. Dr. Brennan will navigate. All communications will be on a closed-loop, low probability of intercept frequency. Questions? Drummond leaned forward, his hands clasped on the table. The knuckles were scarred from years of close-quarters combat training. Yeah, I got one. What's her weapons qualification? Webb hesitated for just a fraction of a second. She's proficient with the standard sidearm and carbine. Proficient, Drummond repeated the word, drawing it out as if it were an insult. We're taking someone who's proficient into a non-permissive environment to hunt a Spetsnaz killer. He looked directly at Callahan, challenging the Master Chief's authority in front of the entire team. No offense, Master Chief, but this feels like a liability. Callahan's expression did not change, but a coldness entered his eyes. It was the kind of cold that came from standing watch on the Berlin Wall in January, from pulling wounded men out of burning vehicles in the Kuwait desert. Your job is not to assess her, Drummond, Callahan said, his voice a low, dangerous growl. It is to do yours. And right now, that means shutting your mouth and listening to the plan. The rebuke was sharp and public. Drummond's jaw tightened, his face flushed with a mixture of shame and anger. He leaned back in his chair, his gaze falling once more on Sarah. It was no longer just dismissive. It was hostile. She felt the weight of it, but did not look at him. She just listened to the hum of the projector, the whisper of the wind outside, and the quiet, steady rhythm of her own heart. For a brief moment, Sarah's eyes met Callahan's across the room. It was a fleeting connection, a silent acknowledgement of something deeper than professional respect. He had trained her at the Navy's SEER School 3 years ago in the frozen mountains of Colorado. He had seen what she was capable of when the world stripped away everything but will and discipline. He believed in her. That belief was a weight she carried, a responsibility she would not fail. The institutional dismissal was a familiar pressure, a constant low-grade friction she had learned to navigate throughout her career. It was present in the way they left a gap around her at the table, the way their conversations paused when she entered a room, the way they directed technical questions to Webb or Callahan even when she was the sole subject matter expert. It was a culture built on a specific, narrow definition of strength, one measured in how much weight you could lift, how fast you could run, how many rounds you could put on target. Her strength was of a different kind, quieter, more patient, rooted in the ability to see what others missed. To them, it was invisible, and therefore it did not exist. They saw a small woman in a world of large men, an academic in a room of warriors. They saw a liability. She saw a problem to be solved. And they were a variable in the equation, one that needed to be accounted for, but not one that would alter the final outcome. The mission was the only thing that mattered. Their opinions were just noise in the data, and she was exceptionally good at filtering out noise. The next day was dedicated to pre-mission checks and drills. In the afternoon, they moved to the combatives training facility, a large, hangar-like building with padded gray floors. The air was thick with the smell of sweat and rubber. Master Chief Callahan ran the session himself. His voice was a gravelly bark that echoed off the high ceiling. They moved through weapons retention drills, transitioning from rifle to sidearm, then to empty hand techniques for close quarters combat. Sarah moved with a fluid, precise economy that contrasted sharply with the explosive muscle-driven power of the SEALs. She did not waste a single motion. Every block was a redirection of energy. Every strike targeted a nerve cluster or a joint. Her technique was clean, academic, and brutally efficient. Drummond watched her from across the mat, his expression a mixture of contempt and disbelief. He had just thrown his sparring partner, a man easily 220 pounds, across the room with a raw display of hip torque and strength. He saw Sarah execute a perfect wrist-lock takedown on a compliant partner and scoffed audibly. "That stuff doesn't work in the real world," he said loud enough for the entire room to hear. "You can't think your way out of a real fight. It's about violence of action." Sarah ignored him. She reset her own position and waited for her partner to re-engage. But Drummond was not finished. He was spoiling for a confrontation. His ego still bruised from Callahan's public reprimand the day before. He wanted to reassert his place in the hierarchy, and she was the easiest target. "Hey, Doc," he called out, walking toward her. "Why don't you try that on someone who fights back?" Callahan turned, his eyes narrowing. "Drummond, stand down." "Just want to give the doc some realistic training, Master Chief," Drummond said, a disingenuous smile on his face. "Make sure she's ready for what's out there." He was deliberately challenging Callahan's authority, framing his aggression as a concern for operational readiness. It was a clever, manipulative move. Before Callahan could respond, Sarah spoke. Her voice was calm and even. "I'm always ready to learn." Her acquiescence seemed to disarm the tension for a moment. It was not the response Drummond expected. He had anticipated defiance or fear, either of which would have fed his aggression. Her quiet acceptance left him momentarily confused. He shrugged, his smirk returning. "All right then, let's go." He stepped in front of her, bouncing on the balls of his feet like a prize fighter. He was a full foot taller and outweighed her by at least 100 pounds of solid muscle. The physical disparity was enormous, almost comical. The other operators stopped their drills, forming a loose circle to watch. They knew what this was: a dominance ritual, a physical challenge to establish status. Webb looked uneasy, glancing at Callahan, but the Master Chief remained silent, his arms crossed, his expression unreadable. He was letting this play out. Sarah stood perfectly still, her hands held loosely at her sides, her weight balanced evenly on her feet. She watched Drummond's eyes, his shoulders, the subtle shift of his hips. She was not seeing a man, she was seeing a collection of levers, fulcrums, and centers of gravity. She was reading the data he was projecting with every twitch and feint. "Come on," Drummond taunted, circling her. "Show me that fancy wrist lock." He lunged, his hands shooting out to grab her arm. It was a test, a probe to gauge her reaction speed. She did not retreat. Instead, she moved into him, her body flowing around his extended arm like water around a stone. Her left hand met his wrist, not to block it but to guide it, her fingers lightly finding the joint. Her right hand slid under his elbow. It was a subtle, almost gentle contact. For a split second, he was confused. He had expected resistance, a block, a struggle. He had not expected this effortless redirection. He pulled his arm back, but her grip, though light, was anchored to his bone structure, not his muscle. He felt a strange, unnerving control in her touch. His frustration mounted. This was not the quick, brutal assertion of dominance he had envisioned. She was making him look foolish. His feints became more aggressive, his movements sloppier, driven by anger instead of technique. He saw an opening, or thought he did. He dropped his shoulder and threw a heavy, looping right punch, aiming for her head. It was a brawler's move, telegraphed and powered by rage. It was the breach of protocol. In training, you do not throw closed fist strikes to the head. It was a deliberate act of escalation, meant to intimidate and injure. The punch was fast and powerful, a piston of muscle and bone that could shatter a jaw. Sarah did not flinch. She did not try to block it with her arms. As the fist traveled toward her, she took a single short step to her left and slightly forward, moving inside the arc of his punch. Her head shifted offline by a mere 6 inches. The punch, carrying all of Drummond's weight and momentum, sliced through the air where her face had been a millisecond before. His body was now overextended, his balance compromised, his entire right side exposed. He was catastrophically vulnerable. In that frozen moment, as his fist flew past her ear, her left hand shot up, the heel of her palm striking the underside of his extended triceps just above the elbow. It was not a powerful blow, but it was perfectly timed and precisely placed. The strike hyperextended his elbow joint backward, against its natural range of motion. Simultaneously, her right hand cupped the back of his neck, her fingers digging into the pressure point below his skull. Her forward step had brought her body into his center, and now she used his own forward momentum against him. She did not pull him down. She guided his fall. As his arm buckled, a wave of agony shooting through his joint, she drove his head downward, her body acting as a fulcrum. Drummond's world became a blur of motion and pain. He was falling, but he did not know how. He had thrown a punch, and now the ceiling was rushing up to meet him. He hit the mat with a heavy grunting impact that knocked the wind out of him. He landed on his back, his head bouncing off the padded surface. Sarah was kneeling on his chest before he could even process what had happened. She had not followed him down. She had arrived with him, a seamless extension of his own failed attack. One knee was pressed firmly into his sternum, pinning him to the floor. Her left hand still controlled his right arm. The elbow locked at an agonizing angle. Her right hand was now an open palm held flat, the rigid edge of her hand resting lightly against the side of his throat, directly over his carotid artery. She exerted no pressure, but the threat was absolute. She was not even breathing heavily. Her eyes were calm, analytical, and fixed on his. It had taken less than 2 seconds. A collective sharp intake of breath hissed through the room. The other SEALs had seen fights. They had seen violence, but they had rarely seen anything so clinically, so silently dismantled. They saw Drummond, their powerhouse, their brawler, utterly neutralized. They saw the woman they had dismissed as an academic holding him helpless, poised to crush his windpipe or snap his arm. And they understood. They understood the difference between brute force and leverage, between aggression and precision. They saw that the punch had been a mistake, not because it was against the rules, but because it had been the key to his own defeat. He had offered her the weapon of his own momentum, and she had used it against him with surgical perfection. "Stop now, sir." The voice was not Callahan's. It was Webb, the lieutenant commander, his voice tight with shock. 2 other SEALs, including Aldridge, took an involuntary step forward, but it was Master Chief Callahan who moved first. He strode over his face a mask of cold fury, but his anger was not directed at Sarah. He looked down at the scene, at her perfect control and Drummond's wide, pain-filled eyes. He did not tell her to get off. He pointed a thick, steady finger directly at Drummond's face. "Do you see it now, son?" Callahan's voice was a low, dangerous growl. "Do you see what you just did?" Drummond, gasping for air, could only stare back, bewildered. "She didn't block your punch," Callahan explained, his voice cutting through the stunned silence. "She let it pass. She entered. She took your structure. She took your balance, and she used your own power to put you on the ground. From the moment you committed to that punch, you were already beaten. She was just waiting for you to arrive." Callahan then looked at Sarah. His tone softened almost imperceptibly. "Off him." Sarah released her hold, the pressure vanishing as quickly as it had appeared. She stood up in a single smooth motion and stepped back, her posture returning to one of quiet neutrality, as if nothing had happened. Drummond lay on the mat for a moment, the ghost of pressure on his throat, the sharp throbbing pain in his elbow, a testament to his humiliation. He pushed himself up slowly, his face flushed with a mixture of shame and fury. He refused to look at Sarah. He looked at Callahan, at the floor, at anyone but her. The demonstration was over. The room was silent. But the perception had irrevocably shifted. The mockery was gone, replaced by a grudging, startled respect. She was not a liability. She was a weapon of a different caliber, one they had not known how to measure. And for the first time, some of them began to feel that perhaps they were the ones who were not ready for what was out there. That evening, as the sun dipped below the Alaskan horizon and the temperature plummeted, Sarah sat alone in the operations center. Satellite imagery flickered across multiple screens. Topographic maps covered the walls. She traced the elevation lines with her finger, her mind building a three-dimensional model of the terrain. She heard the door open behind her. The footsteps were familiar, deliberate and measured. Master Chief Callahan entered and stood beside her. For a long moment, he said nothing, just studied the same maps with eyes that had seen similar terrain in a dozen different wars. "You didn't have to take this mission," he said finally. Sarah did not look up from the map. "You asked me to, Master Chief. That's enough." Callahan's jaw tightened. There was a history between them. A bond forged not in combat, but in the brutal crucible of survival training. 3 years ago, in the frozen wilderness of Colorado, he had watched her endure things that broke men twice her size. He had seen her lead teams through whiteout blizzards and sub-zero temperatures. He had seen her make decisions that saved lives. "Volkov's different," Callahan said quietly. "He's not just Spetsnaz. He's—" "I know what he is," Sarah interrupted gently. "I've tracked men like him before." She still did not elaborate, but Callahan heard the unspoken truth in her voice. There were parts of her past she kept locked away. Classified missions, interrogation rooms in Eastern Europe, things that happened in the shadows of the intelligence world. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a knife. It was not new. The handle was worn smooth from decades of use. The blade showed the telltale marks of careful maintenance, of a tool that had been relied upon in desperate situations. "I carried this in East Germany," Callahan said, holding it out to her. "Winter of '87, Cold War was still cold back then. This knife got me out of a bad situation near the border, kept me alive when everything else failed." Sarah took it carefully, feeling the weight of the history in her hand. "I can't take this, Master Chief." "You already have," Callahan said. "Bring it back when the mission's done. That's an order." Their eyes met. In that moment, the unspoken understanding passed between them. This was more than a loan. It was a symbol, a passing of something precious, a belief in her ability to carry forward the lessons he had taught. She nodded once, slipping the knife into her gear. "Thank you." Callahan turned to leave but paused at the door. He said, using her first name for the first time in years. "They'll follow you when it matters. You proved that today. Just remember what I taught you. Discipline beats emotion. Every single time." Then he was gone, leaving her alone with the maps and the weight of what was coming. The insertion was a violent transition from the warm humming belly of the Chinook to the biting sterile cold of the Alaskan range. The helicopter did not land. It hovered 10 feet above a wind-scoured patch of rock and ice, its rotors whipping up a blinding vortex of snow. One by one, the team fast-roped onto the plateau, their heavy packs making them stumble on the uneven ground. Sarah was the last one down, her movements controlled and efficient even in the rotor wash. She landed lightly, her knees bending to absorb the impact, immediately unclipped from the rope and moved to the designated rally point without a single wasted motion. The helicopter pulled away, its sound swallowed by the immense oppressive silence of the mountains. They were alone. The air was thin and bitingly cold, each breath a sharp pain in the lungs. The world was a stark monochrome of white snow, black rock, and gray sky. The temperature read -15 degrees Fahrenheit. The wind chill drove it down to -40. For the first hours, they moved in tactical formation across the frozen landscape. Sarah led from the front, not with a compass and map in the traditional sense, but by reading the terrain, her eyes constantly scanning, interpreting the subtle clues the land offered. She pointed to a barely perceptible depression in the snow. "Game trail," she said quietly into her radio. "Volkov will use this to conserve energy. Predators always follow the path of least resistance." Aldridge, moving behind her, glanced at the depression. To him, it looked like nothing, just another random variation in the endless white. But he had watched her take down Drummond. He no longer questioned. They made camp as the gray daylight began to fail. The wind had picked up, a low moan that would escalate into a shriek as the night deepened. Sarah established the perimeter, not with words, but with quiet, competent action. She showed Foster, the communications specialist, where to position the thermal scanner for maximum coverage. She helped Aldridge dig a snow shelter that would retain heat while remaining invisible to infrared detection. Webb watched her work, seeing the transformation from analyst to field operator. She moved with the economy and precision of someone who had done this 1,000 times, in conditions far worse than this. As the team settled in for the night, Sarah took first watch. She sat on a slight rise, her back against a boulder, Callahan's knife on her belt, her eyes sweeping the vast emptiness. At 0200 hours she saw it, a flicker of movement, 400 yards out, there for a fraction of a second, then gone. She did not move, did not alert the others. She just watched, waiting to see if it would appear again. It did not, but she knew, with the certainty that came from years of hunting men in the dark. They were being observed. When her watch ended, she woke Aldridge for his shift. "Anything," he whispered. "Movement, southwest, 400 yards, brief." Aldridge's hand moved instinctively to his rifle. "Could be wildlife," he said, but there was no conviction in his voice. "Wildlife doesn't observe insertion points," Sarah said quietly, "and it doesn't move with that kind of discipline." She moved back to the shelter, but she did not sleep. At 0600, as the team prepared to break camp, Sarah made a discovery, 50 yards from their position, hidden in a small cleft between two rocks, stones stacked in a specific pattern. "Master Chief," she called quietly. Callahan came over immediately, followed by Webb and the others. "What is it?" Webb asked. Sarah pointed to the stones. They were arranged in a small cairn, but the pattern was not random. It was deliberate, precise. "Spetsnaz trail marker," Callahan said, his voice grim. "Soviet Alpine doctrine. They use these in Afghanistan." "Someone observed our insertion," Sarah confirmed, "and they wanted us to know." Drummond, still nursing his bruised ego and sore elbow, spoke up. "Could be old. From previous operations." Sarah knelt and examined the base of the cairn. She brushed away a thin layer of frost. The snow around the base is disturbed, within the last 6 hours. She looked up at them. "This was placed last night, while we slept." The implications settled over them like the cold. They had been watched, studied. Someone had been close enough to build this marker, close enough to kill them all, and they had chosen not to. Aldridge's face had gone pale. "He's playing with us," he said quietly. "No," Sarah corrected. "He's establishing dominance, showing us this is his territory, his classroom." She stood and looked out across the vast wilderness. The mountains stretched endlessly in every direction, white peaks against a leaden sky. "He's been tracking us since we landed," she continued. "He knows our numbers, our equipment, probably our objective. He's waiting for us to come deeper, into terrain where he has every advantage." Webb's hand moved to his sidearm unconsciously. "So what's our move?" Sarah was quiet for a moment. Then she smiled. It was a cold, calculating expression. "We give him what he wants. We go deeper, but on our term, not his." As they broke camp and prepared to move out, Sarah made one more discovery. Behind the cairn, scratched into the rock with something sharp, were words in English. "Welcome, Dr. Brennan. I've been waiting." The voice that spoke in her memory was Russian accented, cultured, the voice of a man she had heard before, in interrogation recordings, in intercepted communications. 7 years ago, when she was still with the agency, Volkov knew exactly who she was, and she knew exactly who he was. The hunt had begun, but neither hunter nor prey was quite what they seemed. Day 2 began with a sky the color of brushed steel. The temperature had dropped another 5 degrees overnight. The wind carried ice crystals that stung exposed skin like needles. Sarah led the team through terrain that seemed designed to break the human spirit. Steep ridges that required technical climbing, scree fields where every step threatened a twisted ankle, dense thickets of stunted pine that forced them to move in single file. But she moved through it all with a strange, quiet certainty, her eyes constantly reading the landscape, interpreting signs that were invisible to the others. She stopped at a frozen stream bed. The ice was thick and opaque, but near the bank she knelt and examined a section where the surface had been disturbed. "He crossed here," she said, "within the last 18 hours." Foster, the communications specialist, moved closer. He was a lean man with careful eyes. Since watching her dismantle Drummond, he had treated her with a quiet, respectful attention. "How can you tell?" he asked. Sarah pointed to a series of tiny scratches in the ice, nearly invisible unless you knew what to look for. "Boot crampons, military issue. The pattern matches Russian alpine equipment. And see here," she indicated a small depression near the edge. He rested his pack. "The weight distribution tells me he's carrying at least 60 pounds of gear, which means he's planning to stay mobile for weeks." Callahan knelt beside her, studying the same marks. His eyes narrowed with professional appreciation. "You learned this at Langley?" he asked quietly. "I learned it from the people I interrogated at Langley," Sarah replied. "Men who had tracked targets across the Hindu Kush, who had survived in terrain where satellite surveillance was useless. You learn a lot when you know the right questions to ask." Webb checked his GPS unit, then looked at Sarah. "Our planned route takes us east. This crossing heads northwest." "He knows where we're going," Sarah said. "He's been watching us long enough to predict our movement. We need to adjust." She pulled out her own map, marked with notations in her precise handwriting. She had spent hours studying the terrain before the mission, building a mental model of how a Spetsnaz alpine warfare expert would think, where he would position himself, how he would use the environment as a weapon. "Here," she said, pointing to a narrow valley between two ridges. "If I were him, this is where I'd want us to go. It's the most direct route to his last known area of operation. It offers good concealment from aerial surveillance, and it's a natural kill zone." "So we avoid it," Aldrich said. "No," Sarah countered. "We use it, but we control the timing and the approach. We don't walk into his ambush. We set our own." Callahan studied the map, then looked at her with something approaching pride in his storm-gray eyes. "You're starting to think like him." "I'm thinking like the man who taught him," Sarah said quietly. "Soviet doctrine hasn't changed as much as people think. The fundamentals are still the same." They adjusted their route, moving in a wide arc that would bring them to the valley from an unexpected angle. Sarah set a pace that was deliberate and sustainable, not the forced march that Drummond would have preferred, but a steady, grinding progress that ate up miles without exhausting the team. As they moved, she taught them to see what she saw: the faint game trails that offered easier passage, the snow conditions that indicated unstable terrain, the wind patterns that revealed sheltered areas where a man might camp. Even Drummond, still sullen from his humiliation, found himself listening, learning despite himself. By late afternoon, they had covered 12 miles. Sarah called a halt at the edge of a dense pine grove. The trees here were ancient and twisted by centuries of wind. Their branches formed a natural canopy that would disperse heat signatures and provide concealment. "We camp here," she said. "No fire, cold rations only. Thermal discipline is critical now." As the team set up their minimal camp, Sarah and Callahan conducted a reconnaissance of the surrounding area. They moved in silence, communicating with hand signals. Old habits from decades of field work. 200 yards from the camp they found it. A cache, hidden in a hollow beneath an overhanging rock. Not concealed well enough to be invisible, but not obvious either. It was meant to be found by someone looking carefully. Inside was a military-grade radio, still warm. Callahan's hand moved to his sidearm, his eyes scanning the tree line. Sarah picked up the radio carefully. It was a Russian make, encrypted model used by Spetsnaz units. "He left this for us," she said. "Could be booby-trapped." "No, he wants communication. This is part of his game." She examined the radio, found the playback function, pressed it. Static hissed from the speaker. Then a voice. Male. Russian accent. Cultured and precise. The words were in Russian, but Sarah understood every syllable. "Greetings, Dr. Brennan. I trust you received my welcome message. Langley sends its regards, I'm sure. 7 years is a long time to wait, but patience is a virtue we both appreciate. I look forward to our conversation. The mountain will judge which of us has prepared better." The message ended. The radio went silent. Callahan looked at her. His face had gone hard. "Langley," he said quietly. Sarah stood, the radio still in her hand. She had known this moment would come. The past catching up with the present, secrets that could not stay buried. "We need to brief the team," she said. Back at the camp, Webb assembled everyone. The 6 of them sat in a tight circle. their breath forming clouds in the frigid air. Sarah stood slightly apart, the radio in her hand. "There's something you need to know," she began, her voice steady despite the weight of what she was about to reveal. "My background isn't just SEER instruction and terrain analysis." Aldridge's eyes narrowed. He had suspected there was more to her story. "From 2014 to 2017, I worked for the Central Intelligence Agency, Eastern Europe desk. My specialty was interrogation, specifically turning foreign intelligence operatives." The silence that followed was profound. Even the wind seemed to pause. Foster spoke first, his voice careful. "You interrogated Russians?" "Among others. My focus was on former Soviet military personnel who had gone private. Mercenaries, trainers for hostile forces, men with specialized knowledge of alpine warfare and asymmetric tactics." Webb's face had gone pale. "And Volkov?" "I never interrogated him directly. But in 2016, I helped turn his commanding officer, a colonel in the GRU. The intelligence we extracted led to the collapse of an entire network in the Caucasus region. Volkov lost his command, his reputation, everything he'd built." She paused, then continued. "He swore vendetta, made it clear he would hunt everyone involved in the operation. 3 of my colleagues have died in the last 7 years, all in circumstances that looked like accidents. But I knew better." Callahan's voice cut through the shocked silence. "I knew," he said. "That's why I brought her." All eyes turned to the Master Chief. "When this mission came across my desk and I saw the target profile, I recognized the methodology, the alpine warfare expertise, the electronic countermeasures, the psychological operations. It matched the profile of the men Dr. Brennan had worked against." He looked directly at her. "I asked her to come because she knows how he thinks. She knows his training, his doctrine, his weaknesses. This isn't just a tracking mission. It's a counterintelligence operation." Drummond's face had lost all its earlier hostility. Now there was only a grim understanding. "So we're not hunting him," he said slowly. "He's hunting her, and we're the bait." "No," Sarah said firmly. "You're not bait. You're the countertrap. Volkov is arrogant. He thinks he has the home advantage. He thinks killing Master Chief Callahan's team will break me, prove that he's superior." She looked at each of them in turn. "But he's wrong, because he's fighting the last war. He's operating on the assumption that I'm still the analyst sitting in a secure facility. He doesn't know about the 3 years I spent Darn. He doesn't know what Master Chief Callahan taught me." Callahan stepped forward, his voice carrying the weight of his 4 decades of experience. "Volkov's good, maybe the best alpine operator the Russians ever produced. But he's alone, and he's emotional. This is personal for him. That's his weakness. Personal makes you predictable." He placed a hand on Sarah's shoulder. "Dr. Brennan is here because she can predict him better than any satellite, better than any algorithm. She's been inside the heads of men just like him. She knows what makes them tick, and more importantly, she knows what makes them break." The team absorbed this information, the dynamics shifting once again. They were no longer protecting a liability. They were working with a weapon that had been specifically designed to counter this particular threat. Webb cleared his throat. "What's our next move?" Sarah pulled out her map again, marked with her precise annotations. "We continue to the valley, but we move as if we don't know we're being watched. We give him confidence. Let him think his psychological warfare is working. And when he commits to his attack, we'll be ready." "And if he doesn't take the bait?" Aldridge asked. Sarah's smile was cold. "Then I'll make him angry enough that he has no choice." That night, the temperature plummeted to -25 degrees, the kind of cold that could kill an unprepared person in minutes. The team huddled in their shelters, rotating watch every 2 hours to prevent anyone from succumbing to hypothermia. At 0300 hours during Aldridge's watch, he saw them. Lights in the sky to the north. Not stars, not aircraft, something else. He woke Sarah immediately. She emerged from her shelter and looked where he pointed, her breath forming ice crystals in the air. "Aurora Borealis," she said quietly. "Northern lights." But she was watching something else. The way the lights illuminated the landscape in shifting patterns of green and blue, revealing terrain features that were invisible in daylight. And there on a ridge 2 miles distant, a dark shape moved. Just for a moment. silhouetted against the glow. "He's watching us right now," Aldridge whispered. "I know," Sarah replied, "and tomorrow we're going to make him regret it." Day 3 began with a sky that looked diseased, dark clouds rolling in from the north, heavy and ominous. The barometric pressure was dropping. Sarah felt it in her sinuses, in the way her joints ached. Foster checked his weather satellite feed. "Says light cloud cover, 10% chance of precipitation." Sarah looked at the ski and then at the way the birds were behaving. A raven fought against wind currents high above them, struggling to get below the ridgeline. "The forecast is wrong," she said flatly. "That's a polar vortex descending from the Arctic. The barometric pressure is dropping faster than the satellites can track, and the wind is coming from the wrong direction for this time of year." Webb looked at the churning black clouds. "How long do we have?" "Less than an hour before it hits. And when it does, visibility will drop to 0. Wind chill will be lethal. This isn't a squall. It's a major storm system." She was contradicting their multi-million-dollar weather technology with what seemed like archaic instinct. But after watching her dismantle Drummond and navigate impossible terrain, no one questioned. Webb studied the surrounding area. They were on an exposed ridge, the worst possible place to be in a high-wind event. "What's our move?" Sarah scanned the landscape, her eyes settling on a dark patch on the mountainside about a mile away, a dense cluster of stunted pines. "There. That grove will offer protection from the wind and the worst of the snowfall. We need to move now." Drummond looked in the opposite direction. "Our objective is that way. Volkov's last probable location is on the other side of this ridge. We can push through before the storm hits full force." It was a suggestion born of his need to prove himself, to show that aggressive forward momentum was superior to her cautious analysis. "Pushing through is suicide," Sarah stated. "The wind chill will drop to lethal levels in minutes. We'll have 0 visibility. We get off this ridge or we die on it." The debate was cut short by a sound that made everyone freeze. A low, rumbling groan, deep and visceral. It seemed to come from the mountain itself. The sound vibrated through the soles of their boots. Sarah's face went pale. "Run, now." "What is that?" Foster asked. "Avalanche." The word had barely left her lips when they saw it. On the peak above them, the snow had begun to move. The sudden temperature change and the harmonic vibrations of the wind had destabilized a massive slab. A crack appeared in the white surface, then another, spreading like lightning across the slope. Then the entire face of the mountain broke free, hundreds of tons of snow and ice. Not a gentle cascade, but a terrifying explosive release of energy. A white tsunami thundering down the slope, devouring everything in its path. The roar growing into a deafening, world-ending cataclysm. "Move!" Webb screamed. But there was nowhere to go. The ridge offered no escape. They were caught in the open. Sarah reacted on pure training. She dropped her pack and dove behind a large granite outcropping, pulling her body in tight, making herself as small as possible. It was exactly what Callahan had taught her in Colorado. When the mountain comes for you, you make yourself invisible. The team scattered, a futile attempt to outrun the inevitable. The wall of snow hit them a second later. It was not like being buried. It was like being struck by a freight train. The impact was a physical blow that stole the air from their lungs and sent them tumbling through a chaotic, suffocating whiteness. Then darkness, and a crushing, absolute silence. Sarah came to in stages. First the cold, a deep, penetrating chill that seemed to have settled in her bones. Then the weight, a tremendous, unyielding pressure on her back and legs. She was buried. Panic was a hot, metallic taste in her throat. A primal scream in her mind, but she fought it down, forced her breathing into a slow, controlled rhythm. Wasting oxygen on fear was a death sentence. She did a mental systems check. Fingers, toes, she could move them. No immediate signs of spinal injury. She tried to move her arm and met solid, unmoving resistance. The snow had packed around her like concrete. She remembered the training, Callahan's voice in her head, clear and calm. Create an air pocket. Conserve oxygen. Dig methodically. She had instinctively covered her face with her arms when she dove. That small act had likely saved her life. She had a few cubic inches of space to breathe. Methodically, she began to work. She emptied her lungs. In the small space created by her contracting chest, she scraped at the snow in front of her face with her gloved fingers. Exhale, scrape, inhale. Wait. It was slow, agonizing. Every breath had to be rationed, every movement calculated. After what felt like an eternity, her fingers broke through to a pocket of looser snow. She pushed, scraped, dug, carving out a space around her head and torso. Finally, she was able to sit up, her head and shoulders breaking free into the open air. The world was a ruin of white. The storm had arrived, a maelstrom of wind and driving snow. Visibility was less than 10 feet. The avalanche had swept the ridge clean, dumping a massive debris field of snow rock and shattered ice into the basin below. The team was gone. Her pack with her radio and most of her gear was also gone. She had only the small survival kit in her pocket and Callahan's knife on her belt. She began a systematic search, moving in a spiral pattern from her position, probing the snow with a broken tree branch. Her mind was a cold, clear machine, processing variables, calculating probabilities. The average survival time for a full burial was less than 15 minutes. She had no idea how long she had been unconscious. She shouted their names, her voice immediately ripped away by the howling wind. Then she saw it, a flash of dark color against the white, the tip of a ski pole attached to a pack. She dug frantically, her bare hands soon numb and raw. 3 feet down, she found Lieutenant Commander Webb. He was unconscious, a nasty gash on his forehead, his breathing shallow and ragged. His leg was twisted at an unnatural angle, a clear sign of a compound fracture. She checked his pulse. It was weak but steady. He was alive. She continued the search, fighting against time and the storm. She found Foster next, partially buried but conscious, his shoulder dislocated but otherwise unharmed. Together they found Aldridge. He had a concussion and was disoriented but mobile. They searched for Drummond, calling his name into the storm, probing the snow desperately. But the area where he had been standing was now under 20 feet of compacted snow and ice. There was no hope of finding him alive. And then Sarah found something else, something that made her blood turn to ice despite the storm raging around her. Partially exposed in the snow, a small metallic object. She knelt and carefully extracted it. An explosive charge, Russian military issue, the kind used for controlled demolitions. The casing was scorched, recently detonated. "Oh God," she whispered. Foster, cradling his injured shoulder, moved closer. "What is it?" Sarah held up the charge, her hand shaking, not from the cold. The avalanche wasn't natural. Volkov triggered it. He used shaped charges on the weak points in the slope. This was his kill zone all along. The implications settled over them like the snow. This had been a planned ambush, a weaponization of the mountain itself. Volkov had studied the terrain, waited for the right weather conditions, and executed a perfect trap. He had tried to kill them all. The reality of their situation crystallized with brutal clarity. They were 4 survivors, 1 critically injured. They had lost 1 man, maybe 2. They had no radio, no senior officer, limited supplies. They were miles from their extraction point, caught in a blizzard, in hostile territory, with a trained killer somewhere in the surrounding wilderness. The environment had turned against them, stripping away their technology, their support, their confidence. It had left them with nothing but what they could carry and what they knew. And in that moment, it became terrifyingly clear that Sarah Brennan knew more about survival than all of them combined. "We need to get him out of the wind," Sarah said, her voice cutting through the roar of the storm. She was already working on Webb, using Callahan's knife to split his pant leg and expose the gruesome fracture. Bone jutted through the fabric, stark white against the blood-soaked material. Aldridge was leaning against a rock, his head in his hands, looking dazed. Foster stood by, his good arm cradling his injured one, his face pale with shock and pain. They were looking to her. The formal command structure was broken, shattered along with Webb's leg. Authority was no longer a matter of rank. It was a matter of competence. "Aldridge, check Webb's pack for the medical kit," Sarah ordered, her voice clear and direct. "Foster, find anything we can use for a splint. Look for straight, solid branches from those pines." Her orders were clear and logical. There was no panic in her voice, only a focused intensity that seemed to push back against the chaos of the storm. Aldridge hesitated, still groggy from his concussion. We should follow protocol, set up a perimeter, wait for the storm to break, then signal for evac. There is no protocol for this, Sarah countered, without looking up from Webb's leg. There is no evac. The storm has grounded all air assets. Our radio is at the bottom of a ravine. By the time this weather clears, Commander Webb will be dead from shock and hypothermia, and will be too weak to move. She looked up at him, her eyes hard. We have two options. We find shelter and stabilize him, or we die here. Those are the only choices. Her assessment was brutal and unflinching. It stripped away all illusion of a rescue. It placed their survival squarely in their own hands. Foster, without a word, turned and began trudging through the deep snow toward the tree line. Aldridge watched him go. Then, after a long moment, knelt and began rummaging through Webb's pack. He found the med kit and tossed it to Sarah. She worked with surgical precision, cleaned the wound as best she could with antiseptic wipes, her fingers deft and sure despite the numbing cold. When Foster returned with two sturdy branches, she used them to immobilize Webb's leg, padding the splint with strips of cloth cut from his own uniform, securing it with medical tape. It was crude but effective field medicine. Throughout the process, she spoke in a low, calm monologue, not to them, but to herself, a verbal checklist of priorities. Stop the bleeding, stabilize the fracture, prevent shock, get him warm. She found a thermal blanket in the med kit and wrapped it tightly around Webb's torso. He moaned, his eyelids fluttering. "Sarah," he whispered, his voice weak. "I'm here, Commander. We're moving you to shelter. You're going to be okay." But her eyes met Aldridge's over Webb's body, and in that look, they both understood the truth. Webb's chances of survival were slim. Without immediate medical care, infection would set in. The cold would finish what the avalanche had started. Their only hope was to keep him alive long enough for rescue, and rescue was days away at best. Sarah stood and surveyed their surroundings again. The pine grove she had pointed to before the avalanche was their only option. Nearly a mile away, across a field of deep, unstable snow. Moving an injured man that distance in these conditions was a monumental task, but it was the only task that mattered. "We'll make a travois," she announced. "Use our belts and any cordage we have to lash two poles together. We'll wrap him in a tarp from one of the packs and drag him." It was a plan born of desperate necessity, but it was a plan. It gave them purpose, direction. It was better than freezing to death on the ridge. For the next hour they worked in the screaming wind, their movements becoming slower and more difficult as the cold seeped into their bodies. Sarah directed them, her tactical logic overriding their physical exhaustion and growing despair. She showed Foster how to pop his own shoulder back into its socket, a painful but necessary procedure that gave him back the use of his arm. He bit down on his glove to keep from screaming. But when the joint clicked back into place, relief flooded his face. She rationed out a single high-energy bar for each of them from Webb's pack, forcing them to eat even though their bodies were too cold to feel hunger. With the makeshift travois complete, they began the arduous journey. Aldridge and Foster pulled from the front, their boots sinking deep into the snow with every step. Sarah walked beside Webb, monitoring his condition, her hand periodically checking the pulse in his neck. It was brutal, soul-crushing. Every step was a battle against the elements and their own failing strength. Aldridge stumbled and fell, cursing into the snow. "This is insane," he gasped, his breath pluming in the frigid air. "We're not going to make it." Sarah knelt beside him, her face inches from his. "Yes, we are," she said, her voice unwavering. "Look at me, Aldridge. Look at my face. We are not dying here. Now get up." Foster can't pull him alone. There was no sympathy in her tone, only an unyielding demand. It was what he needed, not comfort, but a command. He looked at her, at the fierce, determined set of her jaw, and saw a strength he could not comprehend but could only follow. He got up. They reached the trees as the last of the gray daylight began to fail. The dense branches offered a welcome respite from the relentless wind. The air inside the grove was noticeably calmer. Warmer. Sarah immediately identified their shelter. a deep depression at the base of three ancient interlocking pines, its floor covered in a thick, dry carpet of pine needles. "Here," she said, "we'll dig it out, make a snow cave. It'll keep us insulated." For another hour they dug, using pieces of bark in their bare hands, carving a cramped but defensible space out of the snowdrift. They moved Webb inside, laying him on a bed of pine boughs to keep him off the frozen ground. Inside the shelter, out of the wind, the silence was profound. The only sounds were their own ragged breaths and the muffled howl of the storm outside. Sarah took stock of their resources. They had a single medical kit, half a dozen energy bars, 3 canteens of water, and 1 surviving rifle. Foster's. Their situation was dire, but not hopeless. "We need a fire," she said, "but no smoke. Volkov is still out there. We assume he knows we survived." She produced Callahan's ferro rod from her pocket. It was part of the gear he had given her, a piece of low-tech equipment that the SEALs, with their reliance on fancy lighters and storm-proof matches, would have scorned. But it was exactly what they needed now. She gathered a small bundle of dry pine needles and resinous bark. With a few sharp scrapes of the striker, a shower of hot sparks ignited the tinder. She carefully nurtured the tiny flame, adding small twigs until she had a small smokeless fire burning in a shallow pit near the entrance of the cave. The small blaze pushed back the oppressive cold, cast flickering shadows on their drawn, exhausted faces. They sat in silence for a long time, the warmth seeping into their frozen limbs. Webb was stable, his breathing more regular, but he was running a fever, the wound already showing early signs of infection. Aldridge was staring into the flames, his earlier arrogance gone, replaced by a quiet, somber contemplation. Foster was methodically cleaning his rifle, his movements precise and economical. Much like Sarah's own, he was the first to speak. "How did you know?" he asked quietly. "About the storm, about the avalanche." Sarah looked up from where she was melting snow in a canteen cup over the fire. "Volkov chose this area for a reason. It's a natural fortress, but it's also a trap. The weather patterns here are notoriously unstable. He's counting on that, using the environment as a weapon." She paused, then continued. "The avalanche wasn't just bad luck. The slope was overloaded with new snow, a classic terrain trap. But the timing was too perfect. He knew we'd be on that ridge. He waited for the right conditions, then triggered the charges to bring the mountain down on us." Foster absorbed this information. "Drummond," he said quietly. "Is he?" "Yes," Sarah said. "There was no point in false hope. The snow where he was standing is too deep. Even if he survived the initial impact, he's gone now." The weight of that loss settled over them. Drummond had been difficult, aggressive, but he had been one of them. Aldridge finally looked at her, his eyes meeting hers across the small fire. "You tried to warn us," he said. "It was not an apology, but it was an admission. About the storm, about getting off the ridge." "Drummond wouldn't listen," Aldridge added, his voice barely a whisper. "He wanted to be the hero." "Ego is a liability in the field," Sarah said simply. "It makes you predictable." She reached into her pocket and pulled out something she had been carrying since the avalanche, something she had not shown the others yet. Callahan's knife, the blade he had carried through the Cold War, through desert storms and frozen winters. But there was something else now, something she had found clutched in her hand when she dug herself out of the snow. Dog tags, not hers, not Webb's, Master Chief Frank Callahan's dog tags. She held them up to the firelight, the metal catching the flames. "I found these," she said quietly, 20 yards from where I was buried. Fresh placement. Someone put them there while we were unconscious." The implications hit Foster and Aldridge like a physical blow. "The Master Chief," Foster breathed. "Where is he?" Sarah's face was a mask, but her eyes betrayed the pain underneath. "I found his body, buried 15 feet down. He was already gone when I reached him." The silence that followed was absolute. Foster's hand moved to his own dog tags, a gesture of respect, of grief. Aldridge closed his eyes, his jaw working. "And the tags were placed deliberately?" he finally asked. "Yes, along with a message." Sarah pulled out a small piece of bark. Carved into it in precise Cyrillic letters were words she had translated. "Two remain. The old wolf is dead. Now the student. 36 hours. She looked at both of them. Volkov was here, last night, while we slept in the snow. He could have killed us, but he chose psychological warfare instead. He desecrated Master Chief Callahan's body, left his tags as a trophy, a warning. Her voice had gone cold, hard as the ice outside. This is no longer just a mission. This is personal. Volkov killed the best man I've ever known, and I'm going to make him pay for it. Aldridge and Foster exchanged glances. They saw something in her eyes now that had not been there before. Rage, controlled and focused, but burning with an intensity that was almost frightening. "What do we do?" Foster asked quietly. Sarah stood, Callahan's tags and knife in her hands. "We honor Master Chief Callahan. We finish the mission. We use everything he taught us, and we kill Volkov." She looked down at Webb's unconscious form. "But first we survive the night. Commander Webb needs antibiotics we don't have. We need to keep him stable until we can signal for extraction." She turned back to the others. "Volkov thinks he's broken us, thinks killing our mentor and our strongest operator has left us helpless. But he's wrong. Master Chief Callahan spent 3 years teaching me how to survive, how to fight, how to win." She held up the knife. "This blade got him through the worst the Cold War could throw at him. It's going to get us through this, and then it's going to end Volkov's war." Outside, the storm continued to rage. But inside the small shelter, a different kind of storm was building. One born not of wind and snow, but of discipline and determination. Sarah Brennan had been forged in the interrogation rooms of Langley and the frozen mountains of Colorado. She had learned from the best warrior the Navy had ever produced. And now, stripped of technology and support, buried in hostile territory, with a killer hunting her, she was about to show Volkov what that training meant. The student was about to honor her teacher's legacy in the only way that mattered, through victory. Morning came with a sky of brilliant cloudless blue. The storm had passed, leaving behind a world transformed. The new snow glittered under the harsh sun like a field of diamonds. The silence was profound, no wind, no birds, just the vast empty quiet of the wilderness. Sarah had not slept. She had kept watch through the night, tending the small fire, monitoring Webb's condition and thinking. Planning. The dog tags hung around her neck, now tucked beneath her thermal layers. A constant weight against her chest. A reminder of what had been lost and what still needed to be done. Webb's condition had stabilized, but he was weak and running a fever. She had cleaned his wound again at first light. The infection was spreading despite her efforts. His skin was hot to the touch. His breathing labored. "He needs antibiotics," Foster said quietly. He had woken an hour ago and now sat beside Webb checking his pulse. "And a real doctor. Soon." "I know," Sarah replied. She was melting snow for drinking water. The small fire hissing as droplets fell into the flames. "We have maybe 48 hours before sepsis becomes critical." Aldridge emerged from the shelter, his movements stiff from the cold and the previous day's ordeal. He stood at the edge of the grove, peering through a small pair of binoculars he had salvaged from his pack. "No sign of movement," he reported. "Nothing." Sarah stood and moved beside him. She scanned the pristine landscape, miles of untouched white stretching in every direction. "He's out there," she said with absolute certainty. "He knows we're here. The avalanche was loud. He'll come looking for survivors to confirm his kills." Foster checked his rifle. The metallic click of the bolt sliding home echoed in the quiet woods. "So we wait for him." Sarah shook her head slowly. A cold smile touched her lips. "No, we hunt him." Bamen turned to look at her. "He thinks we're crippled," she continued. "Leaderless, waiting for a rescue that isn't coming. He'll be arrogant, overconfident. That's our advantage." She pulled out her map. The paper was worn now, stained with moisture and dirt, but her annotations were still clear. "We create a false trail leading away from the shelter. Make it look like the survivors tried to walk out toward our original extraction point. Then we double back, use the terrain to cover our tracks, and set an ambush along the path Volkov is most likely to take when he investigates our camp." It was a classic guerrilla tactic. Use the enemy's assumptions against him. Aldridge studied the map, then looked at her with new respect. "You're going to bait him." "I'm going to make him commit," force him to move from a position of strength to a position of exposure. That's when he's vulnerable. She turned to Foster. You stay here. Protect Commander Webb. You're our last line of defense. If you hear a single rifle shot, that's our signal. Success. If you hear more than one, or if we're not back in 3 hours, you take Webb's sidearm, leave everything else, and head due south. Follow the frozen creek bed. It will eventually lead to a logging road. She was giving him an escape plan, a final contingency. She was preparing for the possibility that she and Aldridge would not be coming back. The grim reality of her words hung in the cold air. Foster just nodded, his face set. He understood what she was really saying. Aldridge's expression had changed. The man who had mocked her expertise 3 days ago was now her willing subordinate, ready to follow her into what might be a death trap. Let's move, he said quietly. They moved out as the sun climbed higher, their boots crunching in the fresh powder. Sarah led the way, creating the false trail. She deliberately scuffed the snow, broke branches, left all the signs of a panicked, disorganized retreat. The tracks of people who were hurt, scared, and making mistakes. It was theater, a performance for an audience of one. After half a mile, she found what she was looking for, a wind-swept ridge of exposed black rock. The wind here would erase their tracks within hours. This is where we turn, she said. They spent another hour moving carefully back toward their camp, walking on rocks and in the thickest parts of the woods, leaving no trace of their passage. It was painstaking work. Every step had to be calculated, every mark erased. This was what Callahan had taught her in Colorado. Not just how to survive, but how to become invisible, how to move through hostile territory like a ghost. She chose the ambush site with meticulous care, a narrow defile flanked by thickets of fir and a jumble of large boulders. It offered clear fields of fire and multiple angles of attack. More importantly, it was on the most direct route from the higher ground where Volkov would be observing to their shelter. He'll come through here, she whispered, pointing down the game trail that led toward their camp. It's the most efficient path. He'll be focused on the false trail ahead of him, not on his flanks. They settled into wait. Aldridge took a position behind a large boulder, his rifle resting on its edge. Sarah melted into the shadows of a dense fir tree, 20 yards to Aldridge's left, armed with Webb's sidearm and Callahan's knife. The cold was a physical presence seeping through their layers of clothing. But they did not move, did not speak. They became part of the landscape. This was the discipline Callahan had drilled into her, the ability to endure discomfort without reaction, to wait with infinite patience for the perfect moment. An hour passed, then another. The sun began to dip toward the horizon, casting long blue shadows across the snow. Doubt began to creep into Aldridge's mind. Maybe she was wrong. Maybe Volkov was long gone. Maybe he had never intended to investigate their camp. He glanced over at Sarah's position. He could not see her. She had disappeared completely, becoming one with the shadows. Her discipline was unnerving. Absolute. Then he saw him. A figure dressed in a white ghillie suit moving fluidly through the trees. The camouflage was perfect. If Aldridge had not been watching that exact spot, he would have missed it entirely. It was Volkov. He moved like a wraith, his rifle held at the low ready, his head on a constant slow swivel. He was good, incredibly good. Every movement was controlled, economical, the product of decades of training and real-world operations. He paused at the edge of the defile, studying the false tracks they had made. He knelt, examining the snow, his posture radiating a predatory stillness. He was exactly where Sarah had predicted he would be. Aldridge centered the crosshairs of his scope on the man's chest. His heart was pounding in his ears. This was the moment. Everything had led to this. He took a breath, let it out halfway, his finger tightening on the trigger. Suddenly, a handful of snow dropped from a branch above Volkov. It was nothing, a random act of nature. The weight of accumulated snow finally overcoming the strength of a pine bough. But Volkov reacted instantly. He did not look up. He dropped flat and rolled to his right, moving from the open trail into the cover of the trees in a single lightning-fast motion. He had sensed something was wrong. Not seen it, not heard it, just felt it. The shot Aldridge had been about to take was gone. Volkov had vanished. "He's made us," Aldridge whispered into his radio, his voice tight with panic. "He's gone." "No, he hasn't," Sarah's voice replied in his ear, impossibly calm. He's testing us. He'll circle around, try to come at us from a different angle. Stay put. Do not fire unless you have a clean shot. A tense silence descended again. Seconds stretched into minutes. Aldridge scanned the trees, his eyes straining to catch any sign of movement. Where was he? The woods had become a wall of white and black, a place of infinite hiding spots. He felt a sudden cold prickle on the back of his neck. The primitive warning that humans have carried since the days of saber-toothed cats. The instinct that screams predator. He was so focused on the woods in front of him that he did not hear the faint crunch of snow behind him. Volkov materialized from the shadows directly behind Aldridge's position. He had circled around with inhuman speed and silence, using the terrain to mask his approach perfectly. He was a ghost made flesh. He raised his rifle, the suppressor on its muzzle pointing at the back of Aldridge's head. Aldridge was completely unaware, his attention still fixed on the trail ahead. He was about to die. From her position, Sarah saw it all. She saw Volkov appear, saw the rifle come up. She had a shot, but it was risky. A miss would expose her position and get Aldridge killed. A non-lethal hit would start a firefight they could not win. There was only one option. It was desperate and it required perfect timing. She took a deep breath, raised Webb's pistol, and fired one shot, not at Volkov, at the thick snow-laden branch directly above his head. The crack of the pistol shattered the silence. The bullet struck the branch and a miniature avalanche of heavy wet snow cascaded down, dumping directly onto Volkov. The sudden impact and visual obstruction were enough. It threw off his aim for the critical half-second Sarah needed. In that instant of surprise, she was moving. She burst from her cover, not running toward Volkov, but at an angle closing the distance while making herself a difficult target. Her movements were fluid, decisive, the product of thousands of hours of training. Volkov, recovering, instantly swung his rifle toward her. He fired a single suppressed shot that hissed past her head, close enough that she felt the air displacement. Aldridge jolted into action by the sound of her shot, spun around, bringing his own rifle to bear. But he was too slow, still reacting to the sudden chaos. Sarah closed the 20 yards in a blur of motion. Volkov was turning to engage her, his rifle coming around. She did not try to attack him directly. She dove, sliding low across the snow, and slammed her shoulder into his knees. It was a move of pure biomechanics, targeting his base of support. Exactly the same technique she had used on Drummond 3 days ago in the training facility. The impact buckled his legs. The highly trained Spetsnaz operator, the ghost of the mountains, went down with a surprised grunt. His rifle flew from his hands, landing in the deep snow a few feet away. But he was still dangerous, highly dangerous. He rolled, coming up with a combat knife in his hand, his movements lethally fluid, his eyes cold and focused. But Sarah was already there. As he came up, she met him. She did not block his knife hand. She moved inside its arc, her left hand clamping onto his wrist, while her right hand holding Callahan's knife slid under his arm. She used his own upward momentum to twist his arm, putting immense pressure on his shoulder joint. He grunted in pain, his knife hand forced open. The blade dropped into the snow. In the same motion, she spun behind him, her arms snaking around his neck, her legs scissoring around his torso, locking him in a rear naked choke. It was the exact same technique she had used to finish Drummond, the same hold that Callahan had taught her in Colorado. Perfect leverage, perfect control. It was over. The decisive, violent clash had lasted less than 10 seconds. It had been a whirlwind of movement, a brutal ballet of leverage and timing. Aldridge stood frozen, his rifle still half raised, staring at the scene. He had been a spectator at his own execution, saved by the woman he had dismissed. Sarah held the choke, her body locked tight against Volkov's. Her breathing controlled and even. She was not fueled by adrenaline or rage. She was a machine executing a function. Volkov struggled for a few seconds, his powerful body thrashing. But he was trapped, his air supply cut off. The physics of the choke were absolute. No amount of strength could break it. His movements grew weaker. Then he went limp, unconscious. Sarah held the choke for 5 more seconds to be certain, then released him, letting his body slump to the snow. She stood up, breathing calmly, and retrieved his knife from the snow. "Secure him," she said to Aldridge, her voice steady as if she had just completed a training drill. Aldridge could only stare. The full measure of her competence finally and terrifyingly clear to him. She had not only outthought their enemy, she had outfought him, a Tier 1 Spetsnaz operator with decades of experience, and she had done it using the exact techniques Master Chief Callahan had taught her. He moved forward, mechanically pulling zip ties from his vest. He secured Volkov's hands behind his back, then his ankles. The man was completely unconscious, breathing but unresponsive. Sarah keyed her radio. "Foster, status?" Foster's voice came back immediately, tight with tension. "Doc, you okay? Target secured. How's Commander Webb?" "Stable. Fever's holding steady." You did it." Sarah looked down at Volkov's unconscious form, then at Callahan's knife in her hand, the blade that had seen her through this nightmare. "We did it. Master Chief Callahan did it. We're coming to you." The relief in Foster's voice was palpable. "Copy that. I'll prep for evac signal." Aldridge had moved to retrieve Volkov's rifle and equipment. He found a satellite phone in the Russian's pack. Military grade. Encrypted. "We can call for extraction," he said. Sarah nodded, but she was staring at Volkov, waiting. 5 minutes later, his eyes opened. For a moment there was confusion, then recognition, then a cold, calculating assessment of his situation. He looked up at Sarah, took in the knife in her hand, Callahan's knife. His eyes widened slightly. He spoke in Russian, his voice cultured and precise, even in defeat. "Langley's best. Finally we meet face to face." Sarah responded in fluent Russian, her accent perfect. "You made it personal, Volkov. That was a bad tactical decision." Volkov's eyes moved to the knife again. "The old wolf's blade. You killed him." "No," Sarah said, her voice hardening. "You killed him with your avalanche, your arrogance. But his student killed you. He taught me well." Volkov studied her for a long moment. Then something like respect entered his eyes. "The mountain should have killed you." Sarah's smile was cold. "Master Chief Callahan taught me to become the mountain. You never had a chance." She stood and nodded to Aldridge. "Make the call. We're going home." 36 hours later, the extraction helicopter descended from a clear blue sky. The rotor wash kicked up snow in blinding clouds. But to Sarah, standing beside the makeshift stretcher carrying Webb, it looked like salvation. A medical team rushed out immediately, taking over Webb's care. He was conscious now, lucid despite the fever and pain. As they loaded him onto the helicopter, he grabbed Sarah's hand. "You saved us," he said, his voice weak but clear. "Master Chief was right about you." "He was right about a lot of things," Sarah replied quietly. Volkov was loaded separately, still secured and under armed guard. He would be taken to a secure facility. The intelligence on his network would prove invaluable. His data drives and equipment had already led to preliminary reports of a major insurgent network in the region. The mission, despite its cost, was a success. But success tasted like ash in Sarah's mouth. As the helicopter lifted off, she looked down at the mountains below. Somewhere in that vast white wilderness lay the body of Jake Drummond and Master Chief Frank Callahan. Both would be recovered in the coming days. Both would go home with full honors. But that did not ease the weight of their loss. 6 days later, Sarah sat in a debriefing room at Fort Richardson. It was the same sterile windowless box where the mission had begun, but everything had changed. Lieutenant Commander Webb sat at the head of the table, his leg in a heavy cast propped up on a chair. Foster and Aldridge sat on one side, their expressions somber. Across from them sat Sarah, her posture as straight and composed as ever. On the table between them lay Volkov's satellite phone and the data drive they had recovered. The intelligence had already led to the dismantling of a major insurgent network. 17 high-value targets captured or killed. The mission was being called one of the most successful operations of the year, but the cost had been high. "Let's go over it one more time," Webb said, his voice tired, from the avalanche. Aldridge had took a deep breath. He had given this report 3 times already, to different levels of command, but each time the words came easier. The storm hit. Dr. Brennan predicted it and advised immediate movement to shelter. The avalanche struck before we could reach cover. Petty Officer Drummond was killed. Master Chief Callahan was killed. His voice caught slightly on Callahan's name. Commander Webb was incapacitated with a compound fracture. Dr. Brennan took command. She stabilized Commander Webb in the field, built shelter, and formulated the plan to ambush Volkov. He described the false trail, the ambush, the final confrontation. She exposed herself to draw his fire, Aldridge said, looking directly at Webb. She engaged a Tier 1 Spetsnaz operator hand-to-hand and neutralized him using techniques Master Chief Callahan had taught her. I was compromised. She saved my life. He paused, then added quietly, she was right about everything, the storm, the terrain, the enemy's tactics. We wouldn't have survived a single night without her. It was a complete and total admission. Coming from Aldridge, the team's most cynical and vocal critics, the words carried immense weight. Webb nodded slowly, his gaze shifting to Sarah. The report will reflect your decisive actions, Dr. Brennan. Your citation will be fast-tracked. The Navy Cross has been recommended. Sarah gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. She did not want a medal. She wanted them to understand the lesson. Petty Officer Drummond's ego was a vulnerability. She said, her voice quiet but clear. He saw the mission as a test of his strength. Volkov saw it as a problem of logistics and terrain. Drummond wanted to conquer the mountain. Volkov used it. That was the difference. The room was silent. Then a new voice spoke from the doorway, and Dr. Brennan understood that survival requires discipline, not just strength. Admiral James Rourke stepped into the room, 3 stars on his collar, commander of Naval Special Warfare. Every person in the room stood immediately. As you were, Rourke said, waving them back to their seats. He walked to the table and looked at each of them in turn. Master Chief Petty Officer Frank Callahan was one of the finest warriors this Navy has ever produced. 40 years of service, 3 wars, countless lives saved through his training and leadership. He picked up Callahan's knife from the table. Sarah had turned it in with her after-action report, but seeing it in someone else's hands felt wrong. Before this mission, Master Chief Callahan submitted a letter to my office, a recommendation. He wanted Dr. Brennan to be considered for the Navy's SEAL instructor program, specifically to develop curriculum for advanced survival and evasion training. Rourke looked at Sarah. He wrote that you were the most capable warrior he had ever trained, that you represented the future of special operations, that you understood the fundamental truth he had spent 40 years trying to teach, that discipline beats emotion every single time. He set the knife down in front of her. This is yours. He would want you to have it. And I want you to use it to train the next generation, starting in 3 months at the Naval Special Warfare Center in Coronado, California. Sarah looked at the knife, then at Rourke. Sir, I'm honored, but I'm not a SEAL. I'm an analyst. You were an analyst, Rourke corrected. Now you're a warrior who can think. And that's exactly what we need. He glanced at Foster and Aldridge. These men have volunteered to be your first assistant instructors, if you'll have them. Sarah looked at Foster and Aldridge. Both men nodded. It would be an honor, ma'am, Foster said quietly. Aldridge just met her eyes and said, I want to learn what you know, what Master Chief Callahan taught you, so I can teach it to others. So what happened to Drummond never happens again. Sarah felt something shift inside her. The weight of Callahan's death had been crushing. But this was purpose. This was legacy. I accept, she said, on one condition. Name it, Rourke said. The training facility will be named after Master Chief Callahan. Everything we teach there will be based on his principles, his doctrine, his legacy. Rourke smiled. Already in the works, Dr. Brennan, already in the works. 6 months later, Sarah walked into a classroom at the Naval Special Warfare Center in Coronado. The walls were painted navy gray. The floor was polished concrete, and on the wall behind the instructor's podium hung a large portrait. Master Chief Petty Officer Frank Callahan, his face stern but kind, his eyes holding the wisdom of 4 decades at war. Below the portrait, a plaque read, Master Chief Petty Officer Frank Callahan Training Center. Discipline, honor, legacy. Sarah stood at the front of the room and looked at the 12 women seated before her. All SEAL candidates, all volunteers for this experimental program, all about to learn what it really meant to be a warrior. Master Chief Callahan taught me that strength is not the power to dominate. Sarah began, her voice carrying the same quiet authority that Callahan had possessed. It is the discipline to control oneself. The mountain doesn't care about your gender. It doesn't care about your rank. It only cares about your will. She picked up Callahan's knife from the desk. the blade that had saved Callahan's life in East Germany and seen him through decades of war, through the mission that had cost him his life. This knife represents 40 years of lessons learned in blood and ice. Master Chief Callahan believed that women could do this job. He believed it so strongly that he staked his reputation on it. He staked his life on it. She looked at each candidate in turn. I'm here to prove him right, to show that what he taught me can be taught to you. That discipline, properly applied, beats raw strength every single time. She set the knife down. Over the next 12 weeks, you will learn to read terrain like a language, to survive in conditions that would kill most men, to fight with leverage instead of muscle, to lead through competence instead of authority. She paused. And most importantly, you will learn that the mission is more important than you are. That ego is a liability. That discipline is a weapon. Behind her, Foster and Aldridge stood at attention. Both now wore instructor insignia. Both had spent the last 6 months learning from Sarah, absorbing everything Callahan had taught her, preparing to pass it forward. As Sarah began the first lesson, she felt Callahan's presence, not as a ghost, but as a foundation. Every word she spoke was built on his teachings. Every technique she demonstrated was refined from his methods. He had believed in her when no one else did. He had trained her when the system wanted to keep her on the sidelines. He had given his life to prove that she was right. And now she would spend the rest of hers proving that he was right. The legacy would continue. The discipline would endure. The lessons learned in the frozen mountains of Alaska would be passed down through generations. And somewhere in whatever place warriors go, when their battles are done, Master Chief Frank Callahan was smiling. Because his student had not just survived, she had triumphed. And now she would teach others to do the same. The mission was complete, but the work had just begun. In a small office adjacent to the training center, Admiral Rourke watched through a one-way window as Sarah conducted her first class. Beside him stood a civilian in a dark suit. No name tag, no identification. She's everything Callahan said she was, the civilian observed. She's more, Rourke replied. She took everything he taught and refined it, made it her own. In 10 years, she'll have trained a generation of operators who think like her, who see the battlefield as she does. The civilian nodded. The agency would like her back. When she's done here. Rourke smiled. You had your chance. She belongs to the Navy now. To Callahan's legacy. Callahan's legacy, the civilian repeated. He trained her for 3 years at Sierra, pulled her out of analysis, turned her into a weapon. White Rourke looked at Sarah through the glass, watching her demonstrate a knife technique to the rapt candidates. Because he saw what we all missed. That the future of warfare isn't about who's strongest, it's about who's smartest, who's most disciplined, who can adapt and overcome. He turned to the civilian. Frank Callahan spent 40 years in the teams. He could have retired a dozen times, but he stayed because he believed in passing on what he knew. He saw something in Sarah Brennan that made him believe she could carry that forward better than anyone. And he was right, the civilian said. He was right, Rourke agreed. That evening, Sarah stood alone at the memorial wall in the training center. 12 names were engraved in black granite, warriors who had given everything in service to the nation. At the top of the list, Master Chief Petty Officer Frank Callahan. She placed her hand on his name. The cold stone seemed to warm under her touch. I kept my promise, Master Chief, she whispered. I brought your knife back, and I'm going to make sure every operator who trains here understands what you taught me. She felt no presence, no supernatural sign, just the quiet certainty that she was on the right path. Callahan had given her the tools, the discipline, the belief in herself when the world doubted. Now she would pass that forward, one student at a time, until the entire special operations community understood that strength without discipline was just noise. She stepped back from the wall and turned toward the classroom. The first candidates were waiting. The work continued. Below in the training room, Sarah had the candidates practice reading terrain from topographic maps. Then she led them outside into the California hills to see if they could find the same features in real life. Foster and Aldridge followed, calling out corrections, offering encouragement, building on the foundation Sarah was laying. And on Sarah's belt, secured in a custom sheath, hung Callahan's knife, a constant reminder of the price of excellence, the cost of leadership, the weight of legacy. She had entered the mountains of Alaska as an analyst trying to prove herself. She had emerged as a warrior who had earned her place through blood and discipline. Master Chief Callahan had given her the tools, but she had done the work. And now she would make sure his sacrifice meant something. The candidates moved through the hills learning to see what Sarah saw, learning to think as she thought, learning that discipline was not the absence of desire, it was the mastery of it. And in that mastery lay the difference between survival and death, between failure and victory, between being just another soldier and being a warrior who would never be forgotten. The legacy of Frank Callahan lived on. In every lesson Sarah taught, in every operator she trained, in every mission that succeeded because someone remembered what he had believed. That excellence was not a gift. It was a discipline. And that discipline properly applied could overcome any obstacle. Even death itself could not stop it. The work continued. The mission endured. And the mountains waited for the next generation to test themselves against their eternal judgment. But this time they would be ready, because Sarah Brennan, student of Frank Callahan, would make sure of it.